Very pleased to welcome Archpriest Peter Perekrestov. He is the Dean of the Diocesan Cathedral of the Mother of God, Joy of All Sorrow in San Francisco. Father Peter has been a priest for many, many years, 35 to 40, and it's impressive. He started as a very young man of 24 years of age when he became a priest, and he's been in San Francisco all these years serving there. He's a publisher. He's published books. He's published compact discs with beautiful church singing. You've probably heard of this set. Chants of the Russian Immigrants, which is a very interesting project because it has diasporan composers, but performed by artists in Russia and Belarus. Very interesting project. And also he's published books about St. John, and he knows how to do websites, and he's an excellent photographer. And so it's a pleasure to welcome Father Peter and hear about St. Sebastian, San Francisco Jackson.
It's a true honor to be here. It's the first time I'm at a St. Herman's conference. I used to take part when I was a younger priest in a lot of conferences, and then you gradually get old and kind of get discarded. So I'm glad my my goddaughter's father is the new head of the youth department, so that's why I'm here. So you have to have good friends, as the gospel tells us. If any of you have been to Russia or to the Holy Land as pilgrims, you probably notice that everywhere you go, there are saints. There are places in Russia where you just walk somewhere and you're walking on the blood of martyrs. There's an annual service in a suburb of Moscow, and what's it called? Butova. And they have a service there, and in Butova, they had murdered and buried people, among them over 1,000 priests and bishops. And the service takes place on a field. And when you walk on the field, you're actually walking over the bodies. And one of the priests there told me, do you know what somebody tell me, what is an antimensian? No, you know. You're a priest kid. Somebody who doesn't know. Somebody who doesn't know, raise your hand. Can anybody at this table tell us what an antimensian is?
It's the cloth on which the priest serves the Eucharist, which has a relevant sign to it.
Yeah, so basically a liturgy has to be served on a special cloth which depicts Christ being taken down from the cross. And it's also a license for a priest. It's signed by a bishop. So if a priest has this, he can serve liturgy. If he doesn't, he can't. I can go on, but maybe we can do something liturgical one of these St. Herman conferences. And if you go to the Holy Land, everywhere you go, there are rocks and there's dirt upon which Christ walked, the apostles walked, upon which they shed their sweat and they shed their blood. And it's an incredible feeling, that you're there, and it makes things so real. But we live in North America, and these things are a little bit more problematic. It's not something you can buy, and it's not something that you can, like artificial intelligence, make it artificial. But there are a lot of surprises here. There are a lot of surprises in America. For example, San Francisco had 12 canonized saints, who either lived there, visited there, or walked there. For example, St. Nicholas of Japan one time came from Japan to San Francisco. He spent a little time there, and he took a train all across America to New York, and then a boat, ship to St. Petersburg. He would usually go the other way through Vladivostok, through the Far East. And so he blessed everything. And imagine, him on a train, and every day he's reading the morning prayers, evening prayers, and blessing everything. And so this land is blessed. And the luminaries we'd have here, they're big time. If I ask you, name me 3 great saints of Antioch, or even of Alexandria, Father Moses probably could, but we'd be hard-pressed to do so. And if you name some of the saints of America, everybody knows St. John. He is the Russian St. Nicholas, and he's basically the most famous and popular and the most global saint in the world. And Patriarch Tikhon spent 7 years in America, and he became Patriarch of Russia, and he had American citizenship. So when the Patriarch in Russia was reinstated, an American citizen became the Patriarch. It was an honorary citizenship. He didn't ask for it, and he didn't apply for it. He didn't pray for a green card, but he received this. So there are a lot of amazing details, and I can go on forever, and that's a problem if you ask my wife. But let's get to the saint we have here. There's such an incredible saint next to us, and the more I read, the more I'm just overwhelmed. In 1853, a family from this region of Serbia decided to move to America. Serbians needed money. They heard there's gold in California and mines, and they were miners. And they came here. Coming here, imagine, there was no internet, there's no telephone, they had no relatives. This family, Ilya and Yelena Dabovic, were the first Serbian landed immigrants in America. Before, there were Indians here, other people here, but these were the first Serbs who came to the United States and became landed immigrants. And to come here, it's not like they had to cross the whole Atlantic Ocean by boat and with all their things, whatever they needed, and then they had to cross the Isthmus of Panama, and then they had to sail along the Pacific coast. And finally, they came to San Francisco in 1853 during the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. And it was still the time of slavery. They came to America where slavery was still, and actually they weren't miners. When they came here, they opened a fruit store. So they had a business sense. I mean, they knew California. They had a feeling this is the future, and this is how they can make a living. So they opened a fruit store. They had 7 children, and there was an Orthodox church in San Francisco, but there were Serbs, Arabs, and Greeks, and so they formed an Orthodox society. But there was no priest. There was a Russian ship standing in the bay, and it had a chaplain, and the future Sebastian Dabovic, his name was Jovan. He was born, and he's the first Serbian born in the United States from Serbian parentage. And he was baptized by a monk from the Tikvin monastery. And our youth, especially in the East Coast, Father Alexis Duncan, he has annual mission trips to the Tikvin monastery, and they help restore it. So just all these little connections and strings. And he was baptized on the ship called Bogatyr. And the first priest sent to to the community in San Francisco, that was the first Orthodox parish. So the first Orthodox parish in North America. Alaska was Russian, wasn't considered part of America, was in San Francisco. So we have the first Serb born in San Francisco, first Serb in the history of mankind. Never happened before. Not during Noah, not during Adam. That's really special. And the first Orthodox parish was founded in San Francisco. It still exists. It's the Holy Trinity Parish, but they've had a few churches and a few name changes. And so this year is the 150th anniversary of the first priest assigned to the first parish here in North America. Initially, services were held on Mission Street in San Francisco, I think Mission and 15th. And Jovan was a very serious child, and he was pious. He had a sense for the holy, and he remembers the liturgies that were held in a private home. I remember that first liturgy service to which I went with my mother. We had to walk a long way along unpaved streets. Furthermore, we were mercilessly drenched by rain. At last, we reached a small house. We crossed over a ditch on a plank and entered the church. The church was set up in a divided room. At the end, opposite the entrance, the Holy Antiminsian lay on a covered table. A little table in the corner served as the table of oblation. And I remember 2 icons on the walls, the Savior and the Mother of God. There were approximately 20 communicants. When Jovan was 9 years old, the Bishop of Alaska decided to move his see to San Francisco because he saw a lot of potential here. And he moved a seminary. It was called the Greco-Russian Seminary from Sitka to San Francisco. And that's pretty amazing. I never knew San Francisco had a seminary. And I assume that's the first seminary. Later there was the St. Platon Seminary in New York. And I think there was a seminary in Minneapolis. But this was the first seminary in North America. And there were about 16 students at the time. Bishop John was proficient in English. And he could... And initially, the Russian church served everybody. There was no Greek church, no Serbian church, no Arab. Everybody attended the Russian church, but services were in English because so all the people could understand. And Bishop John erected a church on Pierce Street in San Francisco, and it was in honor of St. Alexander Nevsky. It later burned down. And then a second church was built, and it was in honor of St. Basil the Great. And I'll show you a picture of that later. So Jovan began studying at the seminary. He knew English, of course. He knew Serbian, of course, and Russian, Church Slavonic, and he had a pretty good knowledge of Greek. And later on, he began reading in church. He worked as a teacher. He went to all the services. He sang and read. And later on, he went to Alaska to be the chanter in Sitka. And there he got acquainted with the missionary work of St. Innocent of Alaska, one of the greatest missionaries in this country. St. Innocent of Alaska was the priest John Veniaminov, who traveled by kayak all over Alaska, and he became widowed, and he became Metropolitan of Moscow. So a Metropolitan of Moscow who lived in Alaska, and he's the priest who used to go to Fort Ross and do the funerals and marriages because they didn't have a permanent priest. And he was a truly amazing missionary, and he had children, and some of his relatives are still alive this day. And later, Jovan went to study to Russia, to St. Petersburg. He studied in St. Petersburg and in Kiev, and he was tonsured a monk there. He received the name of St. Sebastian and a deacon, and he was tonsured by this metropolitan, Isidor, who was the metropolitan of Novgorod, Petersburg, and Finland. And he was a major figure. He took part in the consecration of over 100 bishops, and all the parishes abroad used to be under the metropolitan of Petersburg. All the embassy churches, like in Geneva and Paris. And St. Sebastian wrote about him that this metropolitan was the most faithful friend, spiritual advisor, and material support under God of the young church in North America in her many serious trials, temptations, and persecutions. And I think in Russia, of course, Saint Sebastian, he received, a spiritual formation under the tutelage or guidance of Metropolitan Isidor. After that, and he was ordained deacon, and he returned to San Francisco, and San Francisco had another new bishop, Bishop Vladimir. He was very interesting because he had come from the Japanese Orthodox mission. So he knew St. Nicholas of Japan. He was fluent in Japanese, and he actually brought a cell attendant, an assistant who helped him, who was a Japanese man. And he had this great missionary spirit, and he was able to pass this on to St. Sebastian. And he was the first Orthodox hierarch in the New World to serve and preach in English. And he required all his priests to learn and serve in this language as well. St. Sebastian had great admiration for Bishop Vladimir. He was a refined man, and he had no regard for his personal needs. He was a very ascetic man, and he lived very sparsely and had a sparse monastic diet. Another first, he was the first Orthodox bishop to traverse the North American continent, cross it. I went across 5 times by car. Actually, my spiritual father, when I was in seminary, he says, "Can you take me to San Francisco?" He painted our cathedral, and I said, "I don't have a license." but I'll get it. So I got a license so I could drive him out here. My first trip was Jordanville, San Francisco. And so he traveled across the country to meet people and to find communities and to connect with non-Orthodox people. In 1891, he traveled to Minnesota. And something was happening there in Minnesota. Who knows what uniats are? Everybody who doesn't know, can you leave, please? Thank you for your attention. Yeah. Yes?
It's a heresy that denies the true nature of Christ, right?
Not exactly.
Uniates?
Yes, uniat. Like,
Uniates are they're a branch of sort of this weird historical part where they were originally Orthodox, if I remember correctly, but they submitted to the superiority of the Bishop of Rome and
Oh, good.
back into communion with the Roman Catholics.
Okay, that's closer to the answer. Hoping to hear. So basically, uniats were Orthodox people who lived in areas which bordered with Catholic countries, with Poland, for example. And the Catholics decided, how do we get these people on our side? And they said, Catholics said, serve the way you serve, do everything exactly the same. You can have married priests, you can have beards, you can have churches, but just commemorate the Pope of Rome. And so they got them united, like United Airlines. So they united them, to the Catholic Church. And of course, they picked up a lot of Roman Catholic customs as well. And there were quite a few uniats in the United States. And a large group of uniats came over to the United States, and they were headed by this priest, Father Alexis Toth. And when he came to Minneapolis, he was greeted. Well, he wasn't greeted. He went to the bishop, this Catholic bishop on the left side, Archbishop John Ireland. And they call him the greatest missionary for Orthodoxy, because he did not recognize uniats. He said, you guys are not Catholics, you're fake, you pretend to be Catholic. And he didn't recognize married clergy. And he really turned everybody off. And Father Alexei was very hurt. But Father Alexei was very educated. He was a professor. He knew the church history, and in his heart, he knew Orthodoxy is the true faith. But his ancestors were in the Uniate Church for 250 years. And you don't just say, oh, we're. And this Archbishop John Ireland, he forced his hand. And Father Alexei Toth, he prayed and he told his parishioners, I can't stay here. And they all said, wherever you're going, we're going. And he came to San Francisco, of course, to talk to the bishop. And Bishop Vladimir, a month later, went to Minnesota, and he received 350 parishioners, ex-uniats, into the fold of the Orthodox Church, and Father Alexei Toth was the head of the mission. And a lot of parishes followed suit in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Most of the OCA parishes on the East Coast, especially in Pennsylvania, they're all ex-uniat parishes. And ultimately, over 30,000 people, thanks to Father Alexei Toth and thanks to Archbishop John Ireland, returned to the fold of the Orthodox Church. And not only in America, but this movement began in Father Alexei's home country. In 1981, here's Father Sebastian, 1900. Okay, and this is the original church in Minneapolis. And now it became the first parish between San Francisco and New York. First parish in the Orthodox parish in the Midwest, and the largest parish. In 1981, Bishop Nicholas ordained Father Sebastian to the priesthood. And what? 1891, yeah. And before his ordination, Father Sebastian submitted a report to the bishop that he had estimates that are about 1,500 Orthodox Christians all over California in Oregon and in the state of Washington. And he asked to be assigned to minister to these people. And after his ordination, in 1 week, within 1 week, he left on a missionary tour, and he covered the whole West Coast from San Diego to Vancouver. And, it was a little bit of a train, walking. And when you go to Jackson, hopefully Father Marco will show you a wooden box, which St. Sebastian carried with him. And it was a portable church. It had the vessels, Antimensian. It had a chalice, icons, everything needed to do a service. And he carried this with him all along the coast. He covered over 3,000 miles on this missionary journey. And he would find communities of immigrants who hadn't seen a priest for years, who were unmarried, who were far away from clergy. He found a lot of Uniates who had very questionable liturgical practices, and even their beliefs were at times not exactly orthodox. And he would baptize people, he would talk to them, and it didn't matter what ethnicity you were, he would minister to everybody in lumber camps, in mining communities, and he never expected payment or gratitude for his services. When Father Alexei Toth, after his parish returned to Orthodoxy, he went to Pennsylvania and he needed a replacement in Minneapolis, and Father Sebastian went to Minneapolis for a while. The choir director in Minneapolis had been in San Francisco, and he wrote the following about Father Sebastian in Minneapolis. He was a quiet and pensive monk, always considerate, conscientious, modest. He performed his duty sincerely and taught the Bible class of the parish school with enthusiasm. He was a tireless and unselfish worker, a humble and just man before his Lord. He was one of the most worthy workers in the mission. He was the example of virtuous living. He always considered it his duty to avoid an evil step. Leading a quiet monastic life, he found great happiness in reading religious books and in teaching students the Holy Bible. He loved children and was always considerate of his parishioners. Notwithstanding his short stay in Minneapolis, he was loved by the flock. He was a bright torch of love, kindness, and sincerity. During this time, St. Sebastian made his first visit to Chicago, and he was basically the founder of the Orthodox Serbian community there. He returned to San Francisco in 1893, and he was called to Jackson to baptize a child. So Jackson is how far from here? It's about an hour drive. If I'm not mistaken, it's an hour more or less for sure. And he saw that there's a nice little community here, there's a need for the church, and he talked to the people. And the Kennedy Mining Company and Milling Company, which owned a gold mine, made a donation, and they bought land. The community bought land, and they built a church and a cemetery, which was completed in 1984. This is what gold panning was like in 1851. I have English dry humor, Canadian dry humor, I guess. So this is the church that was built. When you see it tomorrow, the dome will be different. I don't know why. A lot of the immigrants who came here, they had a bit of a complex that they're second and third class citizens. And oftentimes they would build churches that looked, they wanted to become mainstream. And how do you become mainstream? Well, you try to look like the mainstream population. So the church building is not a traditional Orthodox building. And now they have a steeple rather than a dome. And the clergy would also, walk around with the Roman, Protestant collar. And many of them would not have beards, especially the Uniates, because they wanted to be accepted. And so they made these kind of compromises. It was very difficult for them because, and at that time too, immigrants were, were looked down at. And if you had a beard, beards were probably okay then, but in the 50s, it was considered uncouth to have a beard. Besides Jackson, St. Sebastian, he traveled, he founded a church. This is where we're going, where you will be going and having a liturgy on Thursday, Jackson. And they have an icon of the Mother of God from the Holy Mountain, and it's considered a miraculous icon, and they call it the Jackson icon of the Mother of God. Very intelligent face. In general, you look at these photographs of these faces, and they're different. And of course, it's partly the photography issue that you have to stand still, and film was used, and sparingly. But it's also, people had a different image. They look different. You look at old photographs, black and white ones, there was a depth to them, a lack of superficialness. St. Sebastian actually was the founder of this community as well, in Seattle. Okay. He also established a church slightly, not too far away from Jackson, and called the Angels Camp. He established communities in Fresno, in Bisbee, Arizona, in Butte, Montana, and Douglas, Alaska, and all these places eventually built churches. In 1896, St. Sebastian went to his ancestral homeland for the first time in his life to see where his family's from and to make a pilgrimage. And then he returned to San Francisco, and he served at this parish. And this is St. Basil's Cathedral. It was the second church. This church was destroyed in the 1906 earthquake and fire. And a third church was built. It was Holy Trinity Cathedral, which exists to this day, is the oldest Orthodox church in San Francisco. There's an interesting account of St. Sebastian visiting Fort Ross. It took 15 hours to get there because they had to cross the bay by boat to get to Sausalito, and then they had to take a train, which took them to Casadero, and from Casadero to Fort Ross, they had to take a horse and buggy. 15 hours, and he went there with the bishop. Bishop just loved it. He said, "What the air here is fantastic. What beauty, what charm." Bishop Nicholas, and they went to see the chapel and the cemetery. The cemetery was really in a bad condition, and it hurt St. Sebastian's heart to see such, more or less, desecration. In 1897, Father Sebastian and this Father Alexander Khatavitsky met and made a trip together. Father Alexander Khatavitsky was ordained a priest in San Francisco, and he served for a week in San Francisco. And later he returned to New York, where he was assigned, and he built the St. Nicholas Cathedral that on 97th Street, which stands till this day. It's the Moscow Patriarch. In 1897, and then he returned to Russia. He was the dean of the Christ the Savior, the cathedral, the most important cathedral in Russia, and he was murdered by the Bolsheviks. So a martyr from California, from America. In 1897, Father Alexander and St. Sebastian went to Washington, and they met with President William McKinley. And this was the second meeting between an Orthodox bishop and a U.S. president. The first meeting took place between Bishop Vladimir and President Grover Cleveland in 1889. I don't think any of our bishops have met with President Trump. Does anybody know? Although probably the Greek bishop has, or was present at his installation. At this meeting, they were discussing the plight of the Aboriginal, of the Aleuts up in Alaska. In 1898, a great bishop came here to the United States as the ruling bishop, the future patriarch of all Russia, an incredibly humble man, a very far-sighted man who had a vision for Orthodoxy in this country, and it was basically a pan-Orthodox vision. It wasn't a narrow ethnic vision. He was also, he wasn't murdered by the Bolsheviks, although there are theories that he was poisoned, but he was a great, great confessor, and he held the church together with great authority, a much beloved patriarch. Towards the end of the 19th century, St. Sebastian began writing. He did one of the first translations of the liturgy into English, and he wrote books, The Holy Orthodox Church, Rituals, Services, and Sacraments, Lives of Saints, Lectures and Sermons, Preaching in the Russian Church, Lectures and Sermons by a priest of the Holy Orthodox Church. He wrote articles on Orthodoxy, and in Alaska and in California, and on Orthodox traditions surrounding nativity. And his books attest to his love for the faith, his knowledge of the faith, and of course to his pastoral zeal. One of his sermons, we could pronounce this today. I mean, it's really, he laments the rise of new trends in society and the apostasy from the traditional Christian way of life. The craze after unwholesome fashions, the nervous, unsteady rush to keep up with the times, the deprivation of children in stable Christian homes, the exaltation of shamelessness among young women, the disdain of the virtues of modesty and purity, the disrespect of young men towards their elders, of married people who do not want to have children so they can have as much pleasure as possible. Would like to emphasize a little bit the honor that St. Sebastian had for his parents and the honor that St. John had for his parents. You know, there's a little book called Our Thoughts Determine Our Lives, and in it, the elder Thaddeus, he talks about 80 to 90% of all the world's problems stemming from the fact that children do not honor their parents. You know, as a priest, I'm just shocked at how mean kids could be to their parents. I just can't believe it. There are kids who want to go to Africa, want to feed the hungry, they want to save the environment, and they're absolutely terrible. They're murdering their parents with their words, with their disrespect, dishonor, with their unkindness. And it's a really terrible, terrible thing to observe. And it has terrible consequences because many of your kids will become adults. My father's on his deathbed right now. And so I'll be traveling on a red eye to see him. And our Lord did not say honor good parents. He didn't say honor kind parents. He didn't say honor smart parents. We have to honor parents who are alcoholics, who are unfair, who are mean. And honoring a parent means you know your place. You know, if you're on a team, you could be the best player. You could be 100 times smarter than the coach, but if the coach says play number 7, you do play number 7. And if you don't, you're out of the team. And so there's a certain hierarchy. And this hierarchy, when we break it down, you know, if we do not honor our parents, we will not honor God. And like so many kids blame their parents for a lot of things. Sometimes there's validity to it, but you know, that same person will be blaming God for all their problems in life. So it's very, very important, to honor parents, to treat them, because you have no other parents. And we don't have choices. And in the book about Elder Thaddeus, you know, he brings examples of cases where there are terrible parents, and the children protect their parents from, and all the children have extremely blessed marriages and extremely blessed lives. And in Scripture, we're only promised a long life once. Not for reading Acathis, not for giving to the poor. we're only in the gospel, it says, in the scripture, it says, honor your parents and you will have a long life. So it speaks, so it's very, very important, and I'd like to emphasize this. And Saint Sebastian had this great honor for his parents. Now we shall continue. Saint Sebastian also made connections with non-Orthodox, especially the Episcopalians, and he had a great correspondence. And he kept a balance, and he knew, there's lines you don't cross. That is, you meet, you talk, you have to be good-willed, but you have to present uncompromisingly the Orthodox faith. You have to be, Father Sebastian was sympathetic, respectful, and understanding, appreciating the points in which Episcopalian doctrine and practice still reflected the original Orthodox faith. At the same time, however, he was firmly convinced that he must reveal the Orthodox Church as the one true Church of Christ. And of course, he had this goodwill and he had this desire, and he wasn't a fanatic. And that was felt by the people he spoke to, and they had great respect from him. In 1903, Bishop Tikhon transferred the diocesan see from San Francisco to New York because the diocese was growing, and especially on the East Coast, and that was the prudent thing to do. Bishop Tikhon also, he was for consecrating bishops for the different ethnic groups in the Russian church. So he consecrated Bishop Raphael Hawawini for his Arab constituents, his Arab flock. And Bishop Raphael was later canonized as the Bishop of Brooklyn. And he wanted to have a bishop also for the Serbians. And he set up a Serbian Orthodox mission, and he assigned Father Sebastian as the head of the mission. In 1905, Bishop Tikhon in 1907, he returned to Russia, but his plan to have Father Sebastian made a bishop did not materialize. New missions were established by Sebastian in Denver, Colorado. So he's basically got most of our diocese, and actually he received a Uniate parish in Denver in 1904. The Cathedral of St. Basil was destroyed in 1906. This is a very interesting photo, and it's Patriarch Tikhon, Bishop Tikhon, who became Patriarch of Moscow. He was confessor. Behind him is St. Sebastian. He became, he was a saint, a holy man, and he was canonized. And behind them is a priest, and he's beardless. He used to have a beard, but when he came to America, and it's Father John Kochurov, and he built the Holy Trinity, the oldest Orthodox church in Chicago. And he is actually the first new martyr of Russia. Usually, Metropolitan Vladimir of Kiev is, but that's because the bishops made that decision. But the first clergyman to be martyred, and he was martyred in Tsarskoye Selo, was Father John Kochurov. So that's, it's really incredible that somebody who lived here, who served here, ministered here, and received some kind of a formation and influence here, God deemed them to become the first martyr. And Patriarch Tikhon also, he received some kind of formation here. I mean, his life here influenced him in the future. And it's probable that his 7 years in the United States actually, providentially prepared him for his upcoming confession of faith during the most difficult times in the history of Russia. And this is the present day of this church, Holy Trinity, in San Francisco. And they just marked, this building is over 100 years old. Here's the parish, parish that St. Sebastian established in Angels Camp. And this is he established this parish in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. In 1915, he met with Archimandrite Nikolai Velimirovich. Does anybody know who that is? Do you know what's the book? Prologue from Ohrid. Anybody hear of that book? It's the Lives of the Saints. Yeah. And there's they were compiled by Saint Nicholas Milivojevic. He had, I think, about 8 doctorate degrees, including Oxford. It was just unbelievable, extremely erudite man, a brilliant man, a Renaissance man. And he had visited San Francisco, and he became friends. Father Sebastian met him at the train station. They became friends, and they were both missionaries. Really good book in Russian is Missionary Letters of St. Nicholas. Here's an example of his missionary letter. Thank you. So a girl writes, and she says, I don't know whether I should become a nun or get married. What should I do? And St. Nicholas writes, if you have any doubt or you can't make up your mind, it means you're not good for monasticism, because for monasticism it has to be 100%. Another answer was given by Metropolitan Anthony of Suros. A girl asked him, he says, I can't decide, I'm not sure what to do, to get married or become a nun. And he said, you're good for neither. You can't decide, yeah. But the picture of Orthodoxy wasn't as rosy as we think, or as it seems. The Serbians basically didn't like to be under the Russians. They're very ethnic, and they didn't like the concept. And they wanted their own Serbian bishop, they wanted to be in their own Serbian church. And in a sense, they considered St. Sebastian a traitor, that he's brainwashed by the Russians. And the Russians, to a certain degree, considered St. Sebastian to be too Serbian. And there was a lot of tension between the two groups. And the Russian church, not all the bishops who were here in America were very open and missionary-minded. One of the bishops was very pro-Russian and almost exclusive. And so a lot of tensions arose, and St. Sebastian had to hear a lot of really bad stuff about himself, including, slander. And he was criticized. It was a big meeting, and he was very criticized. And there's a letter, he received a letter from a fellow priest who supported him. So he was kind of, he's Serbian, and yet he was formed by the Russian church and served in the Russian church. So, he tried to walk a middle path and just continue with his apostolic mission, but it was a very, very difficult thing to do. And finally, he resigned as the head of the Serbian Orthodox mission because he wasn't able to cope with all these church politics. In 1917, when he asked to be released to the Serbian church, and World War I was raging, and he went back to Serbia to become a chaplain. The photograph you see is the first Serbian bishop in America, Bishop Mardari, and he was canonized at the same time as St. Sebastian of Jackson. In 1921, Bishop Nikolai Vidimirovich, he became a bishop. He was the first bishop to visit North America, first Serbian bishop to visit North America. And when he met St. Sebastian during this trip, he wrote the following. Father Sebastian's poverty amazed me when I met him. I invited him to lunch. Blushing, he said, "Thank you, I just bought a roll of bread with my last 5 cents. And salary? None. He lived on people's freely given donations. And still, even with empty pockets, he planned new journeys to Alaska, to Japan, and of course to Europe. And I remarked, but you are without means." He smiled with his usual childlike and fascinating smile and quoted the Bible, "The Lord will provide." And marvelously enough, the Lord always provided for his faithful servant. Following World War I, St. Sebastian traveled back and forth, Serbia, America, continuing his work, and he made some missionary trips to the Church of Japan. He was very interested in Orthodoxy in Japan, and St. Nicholas of Japan actually wanted him to stay and to be his successor. On his last trip, St. Sebastian crossed, let's see here, okay. He's a bit older here. St. Sebastian crossed the Atlantic for the last time, and he stayed in Serbia till the end. And St. Nicholas writes the following about it. Patriarch Varnava gave Father Sebastian an apartment in the Patriarchate where he stayed until 1938. Then he moved to Žiča, it's a monastery, where he stayed for us with some time. That was the monastery. St. Nicholas Vidimirovich was the bishop of Žiča at the time. On his way to and from, he was steadily accompanied by Reverend Jovan Rapajic, whom he loved most of all, and who took true filial care of the old man. Finally, Father Sebastian returned definitely to Žiča, his last resort. He stayed with us until the end of 1940. From there, he wrote many letters to his American friends. In a letter to Mr. Niko Music, he wrote, "My body is getting weaker and weaker. I would like to see once more the Golden State. All my dearest memories from childhood are concentrated in San Francisco and in the country in which I was born." It's really nice to hear. I visited him frequently, asking how the brothers served him. His heart was failing. Father Rapajic was with him day and night. The last time on my return from the diocese, I went to see him. Sitting in an armchair, he was breathing heavily and spoke in a whisper. "Do you have any wish, Father?" I asked. "Only the kingdom of heaven." And he spoke no more. These were his last words, representative of his entire career on earth. After that, he gave up his spirit. He died on November 30th, 1940. So that's the day of his repose. And St. Nicholas, considered him the greatest Serbian missionary of modern times. He was a missionary by words, by deeds, and what is greatest of all, by his personal character. He was a viceless man, meek and unpretentious. He was positive and constructive in all his works and words. He never engaged in fruitless polemics. Externally, he was a little lean man with a beard, just a priest the Serbian immigrants liked, remembering their bearded priests in the old country. And behold, he was American-born and not an immigrant. But his conviction was that as an Orthodox priest ought to be recognizable as Orthodox by his exterior too. During his 77-year life, our Commander Sebastian crossed the Atlantic Ocean 15 times and the Pacific Ocean 9 times. He spent 57 years in America and 20 years abroad, mostly in Serbia. He had been a priest for 48 years. At the time of his death, all he owned was his gold cross, a few mementos, and 32 books. Everything else he had given away to the poor and needy. He sacrificed himself unremittingly for Christ's holy church throughout America and the world, creating churches where they were needed and spiritually strengthening those that already existed. It was his tremendous love for Christ and his church that not only inspired, but drove him to his apostolic ministry, that made him burn with zeal as he labored to bring all peoples into the fullness of church's grace. So we're all inheritors of his spiritual legacy in America. In 1984, the future Bishop Irene of Australia visited. He was a researcher of St. Sebastian's life, and St. Sebastian was basically forgotten. Here, nobody really knew or remembered him, and in Serbia, they didn't really know him. He was like in America, and here in America, he was a Serbian, and there was very little interest. And thanks to Bishop Irene, he was one of the people who was instrumental in restoring the memory of this forsaken saint. And he came to visit his grave in Žiča. When I came to his grave, recalls Bishop Irene, I was heartbroken. There were literally 2 rusted metal bars wired together in the form of a cross, with his name partially preserved, Archimandrite Sebastian, nothing more. And a movement began to let people here in America, especially by the St. Herman of Alaska Monastery, to restore the memory of St. Sebastian, begin his veneration. And thanks to this movement and cooperation with the Serbian church, St. Sebastian's remains were exhumed from their grave in Žiča and brought back here to America, to Jackson, to the first Serbian parish that he established. And they put a headstone up, and they buried him in the church in a vault, and the headstone had the words, "The first American Serbian Orthodox Apostle." In 2015, the hierarchs of the Serbian church decided to canonize, to recognize St. Sebastian as a saint and to add him to the list of saints, to the diptychs of the saints of the Orthodox Church. Canonization church took place in 2015 in Alhambra, that's in near Los Angeles. A few priests of roll corps attended, including Father Paul Volminsky. Patriarch Irene of Serbia headed the canonization service. He's also a very holy and righteous man. And then the reliquary was brought from Alhambra here to Jackson. Our Commander Sebastian will forever remain as the first American-born Orthodox priest. This detail, not to be overlooked, shaped his ministry from the beginning when his first assignment was as the English language preacher in his hometown of San Francisco. He worked and interacted with nearly all America's canonized saints of his time: St. Tikhon, St. Alexis of Wilkes-Barre, St. John Kachurov, St. Alexander Hatavitsky, St. Nikolai of Žiča in South Canaan. And he sets an example for later generations that one can be of a certain ethnicity and maintain his cultural identity and pride, but still, first of all, be an Orthodox Christian, a member of the Orthodox Church in this country, not only in ethnic identity, but in ecclesiology as well. It behooves us, the descendants of this great missionary, to emulate his meekness, his love for the church, and his strength, his zeal for the strengthening of the body of Christ. Holy Saint Sebastian, pray to God for us. Is there any time for questions? I'm sorry?
Read the last sentence once again.
It behooves us, that one, the descendants of this great missionary, to emulate his meekness, his love for the church, and his zeal for strengthening the body of Christ.
No, the one about your ethnic group.
Ethnic. He sets an example for later generations that one can be of a certain ethnicity and maintain his cultural identity and pride, but still, first of all, be an Orthodox Christian, a member of the Orthodox Church in this country, not only in ethnic identity, but in ecclesiology as well. Do we have time for questions, or I can take a few?
Maybe one or two. Go ahead.
Oh, sure. Father, do you know of any books about his life, covering St. Sebastian's
Well,
life?
this was basically a plagiarized lecture. So it's a new technique I developed. It's called copy and paste. The best is Orthodox Word had an issue dedicated to him and an article by Father Damaskian, and it's really, really good. I mean, I found other materials from some things from Portland and some Russian sources, but Father Damaskian was extremely, the work that St. Herman's Monastery did to make people aware of St. Sebastian. Without them, he wouldn't be canonized for sure. So that's, you could find a PDF online. I forget, just type in St. Sebastian, Father Damaskian, and you'll find the PDF. Yes?
So establishing as many churches as he did is a really tremendous feat. But was there anything else that was signifying that this man was sanctified and that he should become a saint?
Well, there are two extremes when we talk about saints. And one extreme is we think saints are perfect people and sinless people. And the other extreme where we think of saints as, well, nothing particular. On Mount Athos, for example, relics being corrupt or incorrupt that doesn't play any role. They look, if a monk has lived on Mount Athos like for 50, 60 years and was obedient, he's a saint. So to be a God pleaser, in our parishes, I'm telling you, we have a lot of women saints. The priests know the things that these wives and mothers have to put up with, the tears that they shed. They are holy. But nobody's going to write about it because they are so modest. And the priest will know, and the wife will know, and nobody else will know. Her kids won't know that their mother's a saint. Their husband won't know, and the parish won't know. So we don't have to think of sanctity. And in the early church, all Christians were called saints. They were being a saint, holy, is the norm for a Christian. So we don't have to think of sanctity as, miracles and fireworks. That's a mistake. Sometimes the most holy things are so, there's such a quietness. Remember the Old Testament reading for the Feast of Prophet Elias? I think Father James knows those readings by heart. But it talks about, who was it that God was going to appear to Moses, and he had to turn his back, right? And I don't remember the exact sequence. I'm terrible, but it's like there was, an earthquake, and God was not there. And then it was something like thunder and lightning, and God was not there. And then there was this soft wind, and that's where God was. But to hear the soft wind, you have to have a silence. And that's why, the righteous ones would go into the desert, or even, like I was thinking, how can St. John, San Francisco, or St. John of Cross, they were surrounded by people, you can go crazy. You just request people, and sometimes real pain. and I'm sure both of them, and especially St. John of San Francisco, he had a part inside him, in his heart, where there was total silence. And you would like you go into a cave, or you go into your room, they would go, among all the people, they would go into the silent area, and they would hear God. And so if there was questions, or there was tension, they would go down in there. And when there was silence, they would hear God speaking. So, St. Sebastian, he had this quietness, he had this meekness, and I don't think we need anything more. Just like people ask me about miracles at St. John's relics, they all want dramatic things. But the biggest miracles are like a little bit of hope. And Brother Jose, the guardian of the Mirror Streaming Icon of Montreal, he used to say the biggest miracles are not like healing from cancer, or somebody who's not walking begins walking. He says the biggest miracles is when the soul is dead and it comes to life. When somebody has no joy or purpose, and they transfigure. Because that will, a person who is ill, sometimes when they get well, they begin to sin. It's the illness that prevented them from sinning. But when we get the healing of the soul, that's for eternity. The healing for the body, it's going to break anyways. It's going to, sooner or later, it's going to break, and it will decay. So you could have, 1,000 healings, and run around and jog. Recently, our parishioner said the relative is 78. He just got married a second time. He jogged every day for like 15 miles, and then he had a hemorrhage. And that's it. So, the spiritual healings, and St. Sebastian, he was able, establishing a parish is not an administrative thing. He wasn't an administrator, but to find these people, to care for them, to love them, to travel, to sacrifice, to inspire them, to teach them, it's just an incredible thing. And that's what we need in life. In our lives, we don't need fireworks. we need a light, we need direction. So, as far as healings go, I can't say, but when I venerate his relics, you're going to see they're very different. They're different from St. John's. They're like, their color and they're like soft. And there's something about them, I don't know. When I venerate it, there's just something so special. And it's like honey or something. And it's so soothing. So, he's a, holy man. Anything else?
Thank you, Father. Thank you.